1. Battle of Gaugamela, 331 BC. Before this battle, the Persian Empire was the most powerful force in the world, while the Kingdom of Macedon was just a small nation. However, this battle marked the beginning of Alexander the Great's grand journey of conquest. With a force many times smaller than the enemy, only 47,000 Macedonians against 200,000 Persians, Alexander demonstrated his exceptional military leadership by applying tactics that generals would study for hundreds of years. Accordingly, the traditional phalanx formation, with soldiers equipped with 5-meter-long sarissa spears, was placed in the center, alongside shock cavalry appearing for the first time in history. The phalanx formation shattered the enemy infantry frontally, while the Macedonian cavalry, led personally by Alexander, attacked from the flank and thrust deep into the Persian center. The Persian commander, King Darius III, was so terrified by the ferocity of the Macedonian army that he fled. Seeing the king flee before the battle was even over, the Persian troops lost heart and ran, leading to a total collapse. The result of this battle was the beginning of the disintegration and collapse of the ancient Persian Empire, serving as the hinge for the great conquest of Alexander the Great and the Macedonian army. These great warriors went down in history with their sarissa spears and invincible cavalry. Significance: this was the first time a small Greek kingdom stood up and conquered the most powerful empire in the world. This event was also the beginning of Alexander's empire, stretching from Greece to India, imprinting the mark of Greek civilization, Hellenism, upon the nations of Central Asia. 2. Battle of Zama, 202 BC. For centuries, Rome and Carthage were the two most powerful city-states of the ancient era in the Mediterranean. The Second Punic War was the fiercest, witnessing the confrontation of two brilliant generals from both sides, Hannibal and Scipio Africanus, in a decisive battle. Hannibal was considered the scourge of Rome with his historic victory at Cannae. However, his opponent Scipio was also a genius general who completely defeated the Carthaginian forces on the Iberian Peninsula, opening the way to attack the city of Carthage itself. The Battle of Zama was considered the decisive battle for the destiny of both sides, where the winner would master the Mediterranean. Hannibal chose Zama as the battlefield because here he could utilize his advantage in cavalry and war elephants. But Scipio had thoroughly studied how elephants attacked and helped his soldiers minimize casualties from this force. Furthermore, Scipio held a trump card: the Numidian mercenary cavalry. Previously serving Carthage, they were the strongest light cavalry in the world at the time, capable of throwing javelins and moving extremely fast. The success of the battle lay with the Numidian cavalry and the war elephants. In the battle, the Carthaginian elephants were ineffective, and some, frightened, even trampled their own troops. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian cavalry failed against the strength of the Roman and Numidian cavalry, leaving the Carthaginian infantry's flanks exposed, surrounded, and destroyed. Hannibal and Carthage were defeated, and glory belonged to Scipio and Rome. The Second Punic War ended with Rome's total victory. Significance: Carthage permanently lost the power to confront Rome on equal footing and eventually collapsed. This established Rome's dominance over the Western Mediterranean, the beginning of the great Roman Empire later on. 3. Battle of Chalons, Battle of the Catalonian Plains, 451 AD. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, the brutal and great conqueror, had swept through, pillaged, and caused devastation across Europe. Attila stood before the opportunity to seize the entire continent if he defeated his opponents at Chalons. On the other side was the representative of Western civilization, the Western Roman Empire, along with Germanic kingdoms and tribes like the Visigoths and Alans, under the command of the famous general Flavius Aetius. Realizing it would be a disaster for all European civilization if Attila were not stopped, a final alliance between the Romans and Germanic tribes was formed to resist the Huns' advance. For Attila, no one in Europe had been able to stop his advance, so he entered this battle very confidently, despite knowing prophecies of defeat on the battlefield. The battle took place on the Catalonian plains in the Chalons region, modern-day northern France. Both sides arranged their battle formations in 3 wings. For the alliance, they placed Roman legions and the Franks on the left wing to fight the Gepids and vassals of the Huns. On the right wing was a confrontation between 2 arch-rivals of the same origin, the Visigoths and Attila's close allies, the Ostrogoths. In the center, the Alan cavalry clashed with the Hunnic army led by Attila himself. With their strength, the center wing led by Attila pushed back and caused heavy casualties to the Alans. However, on the 2 flanks, things were different. The Gepids could not penetrate the Romans, while the Visigoths pushed back the Ostrogoths, threatening the Huns' flank. Attila had to divert part of his troops to support the Ostrogoths. This saved the Alans from breaking formation. At that moment, King Theodoric of the Visigoths was killed. One would think the Visigoths would lose heart, but this only made them fiercer to avenge their king. The Visigoth wing, determined for revenge, routed the Ostrogoths and the support troops sent by Attila, then attacked the Hunnic formation in the center. The situation became completely disadvantageous, forcing Attila to flee for the first time in his life, leading to a total defeat at Chalons. Significance: this was Attila's first defeat, and the Roman-Germanic alliance stopped Attila's invasion of all Europe. This was also a lesson for the Germanic peoples that they could defeat the Huns without the Romans. The victory at Chalons arguably saved European civilization from the disaster of invasion by nomadic armies from Asia, not only politically, but also preserving the culture and religion of the continent. 4. Battle of Yarmouk, 636 AD. The 7th century witnessed the first wave of Islam under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad and subsequently the caliphs of the Rashidun Caliphate. After completely conquering the Arabian Peninsula, their next targets were the Persian lands of the Sassanid Empire and the Holy Lands of Palestine and Syria, modern-day Middle East, of the Byzantine Empire. Realizing this danger, Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium gathered an army to counterattack the Muslims. Furthermore, a temporary alliance between the 2 arch-enemies, Byzantium and Sassanid, was established to oppose the Muslims. Facing the risk of attack from 2 fronts, the Muslims made a temporary truce with the Sassanids to focus on dealing with the Byzantine army. In the summer of 636, both sides marched to the Yarmouk plain. This place had relatively flat terrain, suitable for cavalry warfare. Indeed, this place witnessed the pinnacle of the art of cavalry usage in military history. The Byzantine army, superior in numbers, about 20,000 to 40,000 by modern estimates, 100,000 by ancient texts, under the leadership of Vahan, continuously attacked the Muslim army, about 15,000 to 20,000 modern estimate, 40,000 ancient text, of General Khalid ibn al-Walid for many days, but could not penetrate the enemy ranks despite pushing them back. Whenever the Muslim army was pushed back, they organized cavalry counterattacks into the Byzantine flanks, forcing them to retreat. The Muslim cavalry was lightly equipped and much faster than the Byzantine cavalry, so they could move very actively on the battlefield and retreat quickly. After 4 days of ineffective attacks and a 5th day with no fighting, on the 6th day, The Muslims organized a general counteroffensive upon realizing the Byzantine troops had lost their morale. The Muslim cavalry was concentrated on one flank, while the Byzantines still used the old formation and did not recognize this difference. When the infantry of both sides engaged, the Muslim cavalry suddenly attacked the Byzantine left flank. Taken completely by surprise, the Byzantine army there broke, causing chaos for the entire army. The Byzantine cavalry was gathered, but it was too late. Muslim cavalry and infantry attacked the remaining enemy wings. The Byzantine army completely collapsed, fled into the canyon, and was ambushed by small Muslim detachments sent out since the 5th day. The battle ended with a comprehensive victory for the Muslims. They suffered only minor losses, while the Byzantines lost nearly half of their initial strength. Significance: this was a decisive defeat, causing the Holy Land of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem of Christianity to fall into Islamic hands, laying the foundation for Islam's existence in this region to this day. Following this victory, Islam continuously conquered and expanded to other lands like Egypt, 642, and Persia, destroying the Sassanid dynasty, 651. Islam began to spread from North Africa to India, threatening the capital Constantinople of the Byzantine Empire. 4. Battle of Yarmouk, 636 AD. The 7th century witnessed the first wave of Islam under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad and subsequently the caliphs of the Rashidun Caliphate. After completely conquering the Arabian Peninsula, their next targets were the Persian lands of the Sassanid Empire and the Holy Lands of Palestine and Syria, modern-day Middle East, of the Byzantine Empire. Realizing this danger, Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium gathered an army to counterattack the Muslims. Furthermore, a temporary alliance between the two arch-enemies, Byzantium and Sassanid, was established to oppose the Muslims. Facing the risk of attack from two fronts, the Muslims made a temporary truce with the Sassanids to focus on dealing with the Byzantine army. In the summer of 636, both sides marched to the Yarmouk plain. This place had relatively flat terrain, suitable for cavalry warfare. Indeed, this place witnessed the pinnacle of the art of cavalry usage in military history. The Byzantine army, superior in numbers, about 20,000 to 40,000 by modern estimates, 100,000 by ancient texts, under the leadership of Vahan, continuously attacked the Muslim army, about 15,000 to 20,000 modern estimate, 40,000 ancient text, of General Khalid ibn al-Walid for many days, but could not penetrate the enemy ranks, despite pushing them back. Whenever the Muslim army was pushed back, they organized cavalry counterattacks into the Byzantine flanks, forcing them to retreat. The Muslim cavalry was lightly equipped and much faster than the Byzantine cavalry, so they could move very actively on the battlefield and retreat quickly. After 4 days of ineffective attacks, and a 5th day with no fighting, on the 6th day, the Muslims organized a general counteroffensive upon realizing the Byzantine troops had lost their morale. The Muslim cavalry was concentrated on one flank, while the Byzantines still used the old formation and did not recognize this difference. When the infantry of both sides engaged, the Muslim cavalry suddenly attacked the Byzantine left flank. Taken completely by surprise, the Byzantine army there broke, causing chaos for the entire army. The Byzantine cavalry was gathered, but it was too late. Muslim cavalry and infantry attacked the remaining enemy wings. The Byzantine army completely collapsed, fled into the canyon, and was ambushed by small Muslim detachments sent out since the 5th day. The battle ended with a comprehensive victory for the Muslims. They suffered only minor losses, while the Byzantines lost nearly half of their initial strength. Significance: this was a decisive defeat, causing the Holy Land of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem of Christianity to fall into Islamic hands, laying the foundation for Islam's existence in this region to this day. Following this victory, Islam continuously conquered and expanded to other lands like Egypt, 642, and Persia, destroying the Sassanid dynasty, 651. Islam began to spread from North Africa to India, threatening the capital Constantinople of the Byzantine Empire. c. Battle of Tours, 732 AD. Nearly 100 years after the victory at Yarmouk, Islam had become a massive religion. Its growth directly threatened the existence of Christianity. In the 8th century, Islam, under the leadership of the Umayyad caliphs, took the first steps to annex Europe by invading the Iberian Peninsula, destroying the Christian kingdom of the Visigoths. The next target of the Muslim army was the northern kingdoms of the Franks and Burgundians. The Muslim army at that time was like an unstoppable hurricane with a seasoned cavalry force that was the nightmare of any army in Europe. All hope was placed on Mayor of the Palace Charles Martel of the Carolingian dynasty and his battle-hardened northern army. In 732, the Muslim army advanced into northern France, present-day Tours. Here, Charles Martel's army was waiting. Realizing it would be suicide to attack the Muslims on an open field with fewer troops, Charles Martel decided to station his troops on a hillside, using the trees for cover and camouflage, as well as to repel the enemy's cavalry attacks. The unfavorable terrain and the good combat skills of the Christian infantry caused the Muslim cavalry charges to be repelled, something no one could have imagined. After many days of attacking without results, the Muslims became impatient and prepared for an all-out attack with their full force aimed straight at Charles Martel's position, hoping to end the battle. This was exactly what Charles Martel was waiting for. While the entire Muslim army was attacking, he sent small groups of soldiers to raid the Muslim camp, which was left unguarded, burning supplies and seizing loot and slaves. While the Muslim troops were trying to penetrate the Christian ranks without result, they saw their camp being attacked. Some groups decided to turn back to protect the camp. This led to a disastrous outcome, as the fighting Muslim troops thought they had lost the battle and began to flee en masse. By this time, the Muslims were completely defeated. They retreated to their camp and withdrew in the night. The Christian army had achieved a victory no one thought they could. Significance. This was a decisive victory for the survival of Christianity, stopping the wave of Islamic invasion of all Europe. A classic victory of infantry defensive art making the name of Charles Martel, laying the foundation for his grandson Charlemagne to build the Carolingian Empire later. 6. Battle of Vienna, 1683 AD. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The gateway to Europe for the Ottoman Islamic Empire was thrown wide open. In just 200 years, the Ottoman Empire seized the Balkans, defeated the Kingdom of Hungary, and pressed close to the Holy Roman Empire of the Habsburg dynasty. The Ottoman army's biggest target was none other than the Habsburg capital, Vienna, where they had failed in 1529. The Ottoman strength was much greater than the first Islamic attack on Europe by the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th century. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha directly commanded nearly 150,000 Ottoman troops to attack straight into the capital, Vienna. Emperor Leopold I fled to Passau upon hearing the news, followed by 60,000 civilians. Duke Charles also retreated from Vienna with 20,000 troops. Inside Vienna, there were only about 11,000 troops and 5,000 militia left, far fewer than the enemy numbers. Realizing that Vienna would be lost without reinforcements, and this could become a disaster for all Christian nations in Europe, Pope Innocent XIII sent King John III Sobieski of Poland to lead a combined relief force of Poles, Germans, and Austrians to save Vienna. At Vienna, the Ottoman army began besieging and attacking the city. However, the city had a system of fortifications and sturdy walls, helping the Austrian army repel Ottoman attacks. One reason for the Ottoman failure was that their commander, Mustafa Pasha, did not want to destroy the city heavily so that he could capture its wealth intact. This indecisive attack prevented the Ottomans from finishing off the city, even though the defenders had suffered heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Polish king's relief army arrived. The Ottomans were now in a dilemma: either retreat to intercept the relief army or capture the city before the enemy swarmed in. They decided to continue attacking the city. From the high ground, the Polish king saw the Ottomans attacking the city. He made a risky but decisive decision to lead all 20,000 cavalry in a frontal charge into the enemy formation. This became the largest cavalry charge in history, with the winged hussars bearing wings on their backs, like angels rushing at the enemy. Caught by surprise, the Ottoman army fell into disarray and was pushed back from the city. The troops inside the city, seeing the reinforcements, also joined forces to attack outward in support. The Muslim army, exhausted after many days of attacking and facing a surprise assault, panicked and fled completely. Vienna was saved. The Christian Alliance army won. Significance: this was a decisive victory, crushing the ambition to take over Europe and stopping the Islamic wave of the Ottoman Empire forever. It forced the Ottoman Sultan to sign a peace treaty, once again protecting Christianity. This was also the springboard for the Habsburgs to later retake Hungary, pushing the Ottomans back to the Balkan region. Fun fact: it inspired foods like the croissant, taken from the crescent shape of the Muslim flag, the twisted bagel, stirrup of the Polish cavalry, and cappuccino, from coffee beans captured from the Ottoman army. 7. Battle of Trafalgar, 1805 AD. Considered the most important naval battle in human history, this was where the British Royal Navy confronted its two biggest rivals, the Spanish Navy and the French Navy, at Cape Trafalgar, Spain. Initially considered just a strategic defensive battle for the British, its results influenced not only the war in Europe in the short term, but the whole world in the following centuries. Before this battle, France had not yet expanded across Europe, but they had the most powerful land military potential in the world. Napoleon's biggest goal was to invade England, eliminating the concern across the English Channel. Napoleon decided this because England was never under direct attack from France, leaving them free to aid allies. The British Navy blockaded French Atlantic ports, while British infantry could attack from the rear as French troops moved east. For the plan to invade England to succeed, Napoleon first had to defeat the experienced British Navy, commanded by the genius Admiral Horatio Nelson. The French Navy allied with the Spanish Navy, creating a combined fleet to counter the British Navy. The battle took place when the combined Franco-Spanish fleet left Cadiz heading southeast. They were detected and shadowed by the British Navy. The Allied commander Villeneuve decided to engage at Cape Trafalgar on the Atlantic Ocean, even though he had previously wanted to avoid direct confrontation. The combined fleet with 41 ships arranged in a traditional line formation. The Allied fleet had 4 first-rate flagships among the largest in the world, especially the Spanish ship Santísima Trinidad, with 130 cannons, larger than any British ship. Meanwhile, the British had only 3 first-rate flagships, but they had 4 second-rate ones, while the Allies had none. This was a key point, because the British had 7 large flagships, while the Allies had only 4, giving the British a significant advantage. Admiral Nelson used a tactic that changed naval history by dividing the fleet into two columns arranged in straight lines, not a horizontal line, cutting straight into the enemy formation, crossing the T. One branch was commanded by Vice Admiral Collingwood, with HMS Royal Sovereign leading. The other branch was led personally by Nelson on HMS Victory, aiming straight for Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure. Nelson's strategy was certainly a gamble, but a carefully calculated one. The wind was light that day, slowing the British advance and exposing them to Allied fire, especially the leading ships. HMS Victory even had its steering wheel shot away. However, as soon as they closed in on the enemy fleet, the British ships immediately opened fire, cutting the enemy formation into three parts. Each time British ships passed the enemy, they could fire from both sides of the ship, raking fire, while the enemy could only fire from one side. Thus, each ship fired continuously, giving the enemy no chance to reload and counterattack. While the British were flexible, the Franco-Spanish alliance was passive and slow. The Allied flagships were bombarded successively and surrendered. Smaller ships suffered the same fate. Then, the two wings of the British Navy, after penetrating the enemy formation, clamped down from behind. The Allied fleet completely collapsed. The only misfortune for the British was that Lord Nelson was shot and killed, a huge loss. Before dying, Nelson left the immortal words, "Thank God I have done my duty." After 5 hours of fighting, the battle ended with a complete victory for the British. They sank and captured 21 enemy ships, while losing none. Significance: this was the decisive naval victory of the Napoleonic Wars. The British not only crushed the French and Spanish navies, but also paved the way for their dominance at sea for the next 100 years, opening the glorious Victorian era in British history. The battle also closed the age of sail, opening the era for steamships, an important scientific advancement for humanity. 8. Battle of Leipzig, 1813 AD. Many say the Battle of Waterloo was the battle of the century, the end of Napoleon's great path of conquest. But in reality, his empire ended after a battle 2 years earlier, the greatest defeat in the glorious military career of the French emperor, the Battle of Leipzig. In the 19th century, Emperor Napoleon and the Grande Armée had almost brought all of Europe to its knees, conquering Austria and defeating Prussia, until the disastrous adventure in Russia made him pay the price. The Grande Armée lost more than 2/3 of its strength. Enemies counterattacked everywhere. His empire was shaken violently. In the west, British and Spanish troops began attacking France. In the east, the Russo-Austro-Prussian alliance, now adding Sweden, gradually pushed back the French. Napoleon decided to break the Eastern Coalition's advance to be free to deal with the British. He gathered troops in the city of Leipzig to protect important supply lines. Before this battle, the experienced main force of the Grande Armée had been almost destroyed in Russia. Napoleon was forced to recruit inexperienced conscripts. This affected French combat quality. Moreover, the French were outnumbered by the coalition of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden. 190,000 French troops versus 430,000 coalition troops. Napoleon's only hope was that the rather loose coordination of the coalition might create gaps for the French to break through and gain an advantage. However, the coalition had learned lessons after disasters at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Dresden. On the main battlefield in the southeast, the Russo-Austrian coalition would confront Napoleon's main force. Meanwhile, the Prussians would attack from the northwest. In the first 2 days, both sides were in a fierce tug-of-war at key positions. While the coalition organized attacks on French defensive positions with no positive results and heavy losses, the French, after successfully defending, also organized counterattacks. But due to the disparity in forces, the French could not create a breakthrough. Gradually, the battle became a war of attrition where victory leaned towards the side with superior strength, the coalition. The French were pushed back, increasingly compressed. Napoleon organized some major counterattacks, but this only caused more French casualties. On the third day, the battle was decided when the army of Swedish Crown Prince Charles John Bernadotte joined the battle along with other coalition armies, forming a belt completely surrounding the French. By this time, the French had suffered heavy losses and heard that the enemy was reinforced, so they gradually became desperate. Some soldiers deserted and surrendered, even betraying their comrades, the Saxons. Napoleon knew defeat was inevitable. He ordered a retreat from Leipzig at night to run back to France. Another disaster occurred when the bridge was blown up prematurely while comrades were still waiting to cross, causing these soldiers to either drown or be captured. The Battle of Leipzig ended with a disastrous defeat for the French army, marking the final moments of the great French Empire. Significance: this was the decisive victory of the Russia-Austria-Prussia-Sweden alliance, marking the collapse of the French Empire and forcing Napoleon to abdicate for the first time. Compared to Waterloo, this was his bitterest defeat against opponents he had easily defeated before. It was also the heaviest defeat, completely destroying his work. From here, the great power role of France was transferred to Prussia and Russia. The victory also brought important meaning to the German people. The southern states were completely liberated from France, preparing for the unification process of Germany. 9. Second Battle of the Marne, 1918 AD. In 1918, the final year of World War I, the situation was extremely disadvantageous for the Allied powers, Entente. In the east, Russia withdrew from the war after the October Revolution. Romania was defeated and had to sign the Treaty of Bucharest. Italy had completely collapsed, and American troops had not yet directly engaged in combat. The Anglo-French coalition was also exhausted after 4 years of tug-of-war with the Germans in the trenches. Realizing this was an ideal time, the German High Command decided to launch a comprehensive general offensive on the Western Front by moving more than 500,000 German troops from the east. This campaign was known as the Spring Offensive of 1918, Kaiserschlacht, or Ludendorff Offensive. Germany's goal was to defeat the Anglo-French forces before the Americans arrived, to exchange for an armistice beneficial to Germany. This campaign caused an initial disaster for the Anglo-French coalition army when the Germans pierced and overwhelmed Allied lines. These disasters were due to a lack of coordination in the Allied forces. Therefore, when the Allies appointed French Chief of Staff Ferdinand Foch as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, the situation became better for the Entente. Although the Germans penetrated deep into enemy territory, they only captured areas of no strategic significance. They could not bring troops to defend, so eventually they were pushed back. German attacks continued in the following months. The terrible pressure forced the U.S. military to enter the battle, even though their forces were not fully gathered. In June of that year, the Germans suddenly pierced the Allied defense line and crossed the Aisne River. This place was only 100 kilometers from Paris. Realizing this was a great opportunity to end the war, Ludendorff concentrated forces on this attack, prong aimed straight at Paris. The Germans attacked fiercely, causing French lines to break. In July, when the Germans set foot on the Marne River, Paris was only 40 kilometers away. The French government was in extreme panic. Marshal Pétain urgently mobilized defense units from other lines and reserves to defend Paris. In addition, the American Expeditionary Force gathering in the rear was also called upon by Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch to protect Paris. The presence of U.S. troops, who had not suffered and were not exhausted by the previous 4 years of war, contributed significantly to strengthening the Entente's defensive front. Despite that, the German army was still a formidable force. In the first wave of attacks, German wings quickly smashed the first defense line of the Entente and crossed the Marne River. However, after crossing the river, the Germans could not seize the enemy's strategic positions. In the second wave of attacks, the Germans encountered the U.S. defense line. They were fiercely fought back and stopped. Unable to advance, the Germans fell into a tragic situation when resources were exhausted and the physical strength of soldiers was depleted after 4 years of trench warfare and then 6 months of continuous marching and fighting. Remember that at this time there were no military transport vehicles. Soldiers had to march on foot, which was very tiring. When the Germans were stopped, it was also time for the Entente alliance to launch a general counteroffensive. From the north, the French 10th Army commanded by General Charles Mangin, known for his reckless attack style and nicknamed the Butcher by his soldiers, organized a major counterattack into the rear of the German position. Mangin, with a fierce and bold attack style, smashed the German northern wing and then continued to attack the central army of German Crown Prince Wilhelm. The Germans were too surprised by this situation, as they still thought the French would not dare to withdraw troops from the north, Flanders front, where the Germans were still threatening, to support the Paris defense line. At the same time, the defending armies of the Entente also counterattacked in support. The Germans could not resist and had to flee from the Marne River. Although they tried to re-establish formation, German morale and physical strength had collapsed, making them unable to counterattack anymore. When the Germans retreated to the Vesle River, it was also when they failed completely. The German defeat was compared by the French to the Battle of Leipzig in the past when Napoleon lost to the Austro-Prussian-Russian coalition, but ironically. Indeed, the role of the Second Marne was no less great than the Battle of Leipzig. This defeat also marked the collapse of the German Second Reich, just like Napoleon's French Empire. Significance. This was the decisive victory of World War I, marking the complete failure of the Germans not only in their 1918 counteroffensive campaign, but also in the entire war. From here, the German army collapsed completely, leading to Germany's defeat 3 months later, the Kaiser's abdication, and the collapse of the German Second Reich. Also from here began a new world order that is the foundation for the world today. 10. Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943 AD. No words can fully describe the horror and brutality of the Battle of Stalingrad, not only because of the largest casualty level in human history, but also because of the fighting style of both sides, the Soviet Red Army and Nazi Germany. Both sides were uncompromising and ready to push their troops to death. After completely defeating the French army, the Germans began to pivot to the east to prepare to attack their arch-enemy, the Soviet Union. In 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union across the entire western border. The initial period was a disaster for the Red Army. The Germans knocked out all defensive armies, destroying a large Red Army force. By the end of 1941, the Germans were at the gates of the capital, Moscow. At the most critical moment, winter saved Russia just like Napoleon's invasion 200 years earlier. Reserve armies and General Zhukov's Siberian army took advantage of the freezing weather to defeat the Germans and protect Moscow. Here, Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg tactic against the Soviet Union had failed. However, the chance to defeat the Soviet Union was not over. Entering 1942, the Germans stabilized the situation on the fronts with their strength and gradually pivoted south, sending seasoned armies towards the Caucasus region, considered the source of food, supplies, and oil fields for the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the city of Stalingrad was a place the Germans considered must be taken at all costs. Not only because it was the largest industrial city in the southern Soviet Union, but also a transshipment point for goods from the Caucasus to the north. Capturing this place meant strangling the northern Soviet Union. Another special reason was the city's name, Stalingrad. Destroying this place was like a slap in the face to the Soviet supreme leader, Joseph Stalin. The German plan to advance south met with fierce resistance from the Red Army, but overall, the basic objectives were achieved. By the end of July, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The German Air Force, Luftwaffe, initiated the attack on the city with airstrikes. In just a few days, the Soviet Union's most modern industrial city was destroyed in rains of bombs. High-rise buildings and architectural works were reduced to rubble. The Soviet Air Force was overwhelmed by the Germans, making German airstrikes face few obstacles and causing huge damage to civilians and the Soviet army. The supply route from the East Bank crossing the Volga River to the West Bank, where the fighting took place, was fiercely attacked by the Germans. Most boats crossing the river were destroyed, leaving goods, supplies, and people stranded on both riverbanks. After the airstrikes, thinking they could crush the Red Army's will, the Germans began sending infantry into the city. However, contrary to expectations, the Germans met very fierce resistance from Soviet defense units. Not only the Red Army's fierce resistance, but limited firepower was part of the reason the Germans faced difficulties entering the city. The Germans were famous for mobile tactics, coordinating combined arms attacks between artillery, air force, and infantry smoothly. However, attacking the city with the cramped terrain of streets and buildings forced them to limit firepower to avoid hitting their own troops. Understanding this, the Red Army also used hugging tactics, keeping close to the Germans, to minimize the enemy's firepower advantage, executing the order not a step back. To hold the Germans, the Red Army also had to pay a very high price with tens of thousands of casualties of both soldiers and civilians, many times more than the enemy. The Soviet Union mobilized northern armies to reinforce Stalingrad, accepting high casualties, sending troops across the river to hold the city. The situation became a stalemate as the Germans could not advance while the Red Army's losses were too heavy to organize a counterattack. The German plan to take the city before winter failed. After 3 months of attacks, in October 1942, the Germans finally thrust deep to the banks of the Volga River, cutting the Red Army in two and occupying 90% of the city. However, winter had arrived, and warfare was hindered by harsh weather. The Germans could not launch further attacks to destroy the remaining Red Army strongholds, partly because air units were deployed to North Africa, partly because soldiers had begun to tire and suffer losses after 3 months of attacks. When the Germans bogged down, it was time for the Red Army to counterattack. Occupying the city and cutting the enemy in two inadvertently put the Germans in a position of being besieged within the city. Simultaneously, while most of the German main force was stuck inside the city, outside, the German rear was only protected by vassal forces like Italy, Romania, and Hungary, which had weak combat power. In November 1942, amidst the freezing winter, 7 Soviet armies were concentrated to begin Operation Uranus, encircling the Germans in a pincer movement from the northwest and southeast. Soviet wings utilized the element of surprise and numerical superiority to quickly wipe out Italian and Romanian wings on the perimeter, pushing the entire enemy into inner Stalingrad. The entire force of over 300,000 Axis troops was trapped in the ruined city. The cutting of supply lines caused German combat power and morale to decline severely. The German command planned to break out of Stalingrad, but was soon divided when Hitler wanted the Germans not to surrender, to continue fighting in Stalingrad and wait for reinforcements. Some other generals wanted the troops in the city to break out immediately and retreat to the rear line. Finally, the Germans had to stay in Stalingrad. Actually, this was a mandatory decision because if the Germans withdrew from Stalingrad, the German corps in the Caucasus would be cut off and completely abandoned. The Germans had to hold out waiting for reinforcements, but the situation worsened. The German Air Force could not supply enough food, medicine, or even winter clothes for the soldiers, and German morale dropped lower day by day. By December 25, 1942, the battle was considered decided when the Red Army defeated the German mechanized relief force. All hope of a German breakout vanished. By this time, Hitler and the German High Command also understood the battle was over. However, Hitler still ordered General Paulus, commander of the German troops in Stalingrad, not to surrender, aiming to let the Southern Corps retreat. Partly also to save face for Hitler with German will. By the end of January 1943, the situation was extremely tragic for the Germans. The Red Army captured the last airfield. The Germans had no hope of evacuation. In a desperate situation, Paulus decided to surrender to help the soldiers survive. The entire German and vassal army surrendered shortly after. Thus, after more than 8 months of fighting, the bloodiest battle in human history ended with a turning-point victory for World War II. Although the Soviet Union won this battle, they suffered enormous losses. More than 1 million people, including soldiers and civilians, were killed and wounded. Tens of thousands of pieces of equipment were destroyed. The industrial city of Stalingrad was completely destroyed. On the other side, nearly 1 million soldiers, mostly German, Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Croatian, died or were captured. Significance. This was the decisive victory and turning point of the Eastern European Front, as well as the entire Second World War. The Soviet Union shifted from a defensive posture to a comprehensive counterattack against the Germans, leading to the Battle of Kursk, which decided the situation in Europe. This victory once again had the contribution of climatic conditions. Winter saved the Soviet Union from disaster as it had saved them before in the war with Napoleon or at the Battle of Moscow. The Battle of Stalingrad was the springboard for communism and the Soviet Union to stand firm and smash fascism, changing world history forever. And those are 10 battles of great significance to human history. In addition to the 10 battles mentioned above, join the Conflict Chronicle in the next part called Honorable Mentions, which includes other famous battles throughout history.